Summer of 1944. Across the vast plains of Kansas, the heat shimmered over fields of ripening wheat and endless rows of corn. The war in Europe was reaching its peak, yet here, thousands of miles from the front lines, its quiet echo could be heard in the rhythmic sound of shovels striking the soil. Bent over the furrows were men in faded gray-green uniforms, their sleeves rolled up, their boots covered in dust. On their backs were stenciled letters, PW for Prisoner of War. They were soldiers of the German army, now farmhands in the middle of the United States. The small rural towns that surrounded these fields had changed since the war began. With so many American men overseas, farms struggled to find laborers. The government turned to an unexpected solution: the labor of captured enemy soldiers. By the summer of 1944, more than 400,000 German prisoners were scattered across the country, housed in camps from Texas to Minnesota, from Georgia to Oregon. Every morning, guarded by a few soldiers in jeeps, groups of prisoners were driven out to local farms. The trucks rumbled down dirt roads lined with mailboxes and windmills, carrying men who, only months earlier, had fought against the same flag that now flew above the barns. For many of these Germans, America was nothing like they had imagined. Nazi propaganda had warned that capture by the Allies meant humiliation, beatings, and forced labor until death. Instead, they found a landscape of open skies, quiet towns, and ordinary people who seemed oddly unconcerned with vengeance. The prisoners lived in barracks, ate 3 meals a day, and were issued clean clothing. They were even allowed to write home, attend classes, and, most surprisingly, work for pay. The fields of the Midwest became their classrooms in a strange new world. Under the scorching sun, they harvested wheat, loaded hay bales, and repaired fences alongside aging farmers and teenage boys. The air smelled of soil, diesel, and freshly cut grain. When the workday ended, the prisoners gathered near the trucks, waiting for the return to camp. It was there, in those ordinary moments, that something quietly revolutionary happened. Instead of punishment, they received small paper coupons, payment for their labor, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The gesture was simple, yet it unsettled many of them. The idea that an enemy would pay a captured soldier for his work ran against everything they had been taught. In Hitler's Germany, prisoners of war were slaves, expendable tools for the war machine. Here, in America, even an enemy's time had value. Some of the men folded the coupons carefully, unsure what to do with them. Others looked at them with disbelief, as if they might vanish in the wind. The trucks rolled away, raising clouds of dust that glowed red in the evening sun. Behind the barbed wire of the camp, the prisoners lined up for dinner: meatloaf, potatoes, and bread far softer than what they had eaten at the front. They talked quietly in German about the day's work, about the strange decency of their captors, about how everything in this country seemed to contradict what they had been told. The sound of crickets filled the night air, blending with distant music from a farmhouse radio. For those men, the American heartland was more than a place of confinement. It was a mirror, reflecting a different kind of power. Not the power of guns or ideology, but the quiet authority of fairness. In a world still burning with hatred, this simple exchange of labor for pay carried a message that many would not forget. It suggested that dignity could survive even in captivity, and that humanity could exist even between enemies. By the time summer faded into autumn, the German prisoners began to understand that their captivity in America was not merely a pause in the war. It was the beginning of an education in a different kind of civilization. And for many of them, the first lesson had been written not in books, but on those small slips of paper that said, in their own silent way, that respect could be stronger than revenge. For the German soldiers who had grown up under the ideology of total war, the idea of being paid for labor in captivity defied everything they believed about power, hierarchy, and justice. They had been raised in a nation where the state demanded everything: time, strength, loyalty, even life itself, and where mercy was often seen as weakness. In the Reich, prisoners of war were stripped of identity and turned into instruments of production. The German military used captured soldiers from the East as expendable labor, often worked to exhaustion or death without compensation. To those men who had lived inside such a system, captivity in America was expected to be a mirror of that cruelty. When the German POWs arrived in the United States, they braced themselves for punishment. They expected chains, starvation, and endless toil under the eyes of guards. Many thought they would be sent to coal mines or construction camps, like the foreign workers they themselves had once overseen. The word prisoner carried a grim image, one of humiliation and forced submission. Yet what they encountered instead was a world governed by regulations, paperwork, and a peculiar sense of fairness. The United States, adhering strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention, established a system that granted prisoners rights that would have been unimaginable under Nazi authority. They were required to work, yes, but only on non-military tasks, and always under humane conditions. They were given meals equivalent in calories to those of American troops, provided with medical care, recreation, and education. Most confounding of all, their labor was compensated. Each working day earned them credit in the form of camp scrip, paper coupons worth 10 cents per hour, that could be used to buy items like cigarettes, stationery, or coffee at the canteen. The psychological shock of this arrangement ran deep. To men trained to see themselves as the elite of a conquering army, the notion of being treated according to international law rather than revenge was disorienting. The propaganda that had sustained them in battle, the idea that the Western Allies were hypocritical, greedy, and brutal, began to collapse the moment they saw an American officer record their hours on a clipboard. They were no longer masters of war, but neither were they slaves. They occupied a strange, moral middle ground that the Nazi worldview had never prepared them for. Some reacted with suspicion, convinced that the kindness was a facade meant to break their will. Others felt guilt, knowing that millions of Soviet, Polish, and French prisoners in German hands had been denied even the right to live. The contrast between their own treatment and the suffering inflicted by their army created an invisible tension that weighed on them daily. The meals they ate, the pay they received, and the respect shown to them by their captors became a constant reminder of a moral divide between the world they had come from and the one they now inhabited. On the farms where they worked, this contradiction grew more tangible. They labored in fields belonging to men whose sons were fighting against them overseas, yet those same men offered them water and food without hesitation. The farmers' wives sometimes brought them sandwiches or pies, not as charity, but as routine courtesy. Each gesture blurred the boundaries between enemy and human being. For soldiers indoctrinated in the belief that compassion toward the enemy was treason, such moments were profoundly unsettling. In the rigid structure of Nazi ideology, work was a weapon and captivity a form of degradation. But in America, work was transformed into something else, a test of integrity, a bridge between enemies. The German prisoners could not easily accept it. Many wrote in their diaries that they struggled to understand why the United States followed rules when it had no obligation to. The very idea that their labor had value in the eyes of the enemy contradicted years of indoctrination. That was the real problem, not hunger, not punishment, but the quiet realization that the enemy's system functioned on principles they had been taught to despise: legality, fairness, and respect for individual dignity. Every paycheck stub, every meal served on a clean plate, every day spent under a sunlit sky instead of a whip, forced them to confront a truth far more difficult than defeat. They had not only lost a war of weapons, but also a war of moral philosophy. By 1943, the United States faced a paradox born of global war. While millions of American men were fighting across Europe and the Pacific, the vast agricultural heartland of the nation struggled to sustain itself. Fields went untilled, fruit rotted on trees, and farmers who once relied on family and local labor watched their crops wither for lack of hands. To preserve the nation's food supply, the government turned to a solution as unconventional as it was pragmatic: the labor of captured enemy soldiers. That same year, the tide of war began to shift dramatically in North Africa. The surrender of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps and its allied divisions resulted in the capture of more than 275,000 Axis troops, a mix of Germans, Italians, and smaller contingents from occupied nations. The United States, possessing the shipping capacity and secure territory to house them, agreed to take a substantial number. By the end of 1943, ships were docking at ports from New York to New Orleans, carrying thousands of German prisoners under armed guard. They arrived not in chains, but as part of a meticulously organized logistical operation governed by international law. The legal framework that defined their treatment was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. It mandated humane conditions, adequate food, medical care, and protection from violence or forced labor. Crucially, it permitted captors to employ prisoners for non-military work, provided that the tasks were not dangerous, humiliating, or directly connected to combat. The prisoners had to be compensated, either with direct pay or credit, and their working conditions had to mirror those of local civilians. The United States, determined to uphold its moral and diplomatic reputation, followed these principles with bureaucratic precision. By 1944, the War Department and the War Manpower Commission jointly oversaw a network of more than 700 main and branch POW camps scattered across the continental United States. The largest were located in Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Kansas, regions rich in farmland and desperately short on labor. Smaller satellite camps operated seasonally, often consisting of little more than a cluster of barracks surrounded by barbed wire near canning factories, orchards, and ranches. In total, approximately 425,000 German prisoners were interned on American soil by the war's end, making the United States the single largest holder of Axis POWs outside Europe. Each camp functioned as a self-contained community under military administration. Prisoners were categorized by rank and political affiliation, officers were separated from enlisted men, and known Nazi Party members were monitored closely. They received uniforms marked with PW, regular rations comparable to those of U.S. soldiers, and access to medical facilities. Inside the camps, libraries, sports fields, theaters, and even orchestras emerged, often organized by the prisoners themselves. Yet beyond the fences, another system evolved, one that connected these foreign captives directly to the rhythms of American life. The American agricultural economy had entered crisis by 1942. With more than 10 million citizens serving in the armed forces and countless others employed in defense industries, the countryside was hollowed out. Seasonal crops required immediate attention, but domestic programs like the Women's Land Army and the Bracero program with Mexico could not fully meet the demand. The government's solution was to make POW labor available to private contractors and farmers under strict regulation. Local agricultural offices coordinated with military authorities, setting wage rates, hours, and transportation. Farmers paid the government a fixed rate, generally around 40 to 45 cents per hour per worker, while prisoners received 10 cents an hour in camp currency, a modest sum, but one that symbolized legality and respect under the Geneva Convention. This arrangement not only solved an urgent economic need but also became a quiet experiment in moral governance during wartime. The United States used its handling of prisoners to demonstrate adherence to international law and to contrast its principles with those of the Axis powers. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General and the International Red Cross documented the generally high standards of living within American camps. Complaints, when they occurred, usually involved boredom rather than abuse. By late 1944, the German POW camps had become a familiar part of the American landscape. Columns of men in marked uniforms could be seen working in cotton fields in Alabama, picking oranges in Florida, harvesting sugar beets in Colorado, or mending fences on the plains of Nebraska. Their presence was a reminder that the war, though distant, had reached even the most peaceful corners of rural America. Historically, this system of captivity represented a rare intersection of pragmatism and principle. It met the country's economic needs while adhering to the spirit of international law. The American decision to pay its prisoners, feed them adequately, and provide education and recreation stood in stark contrast to the brutal exploitation practiced by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. For the German soldiers who lived through it, this unexpected humanity would become one of the most enduring and bewildering experiences of their lives, a paradox that blurred the lines between defeat and dignity. When the first groups of German prisoners stepped off the military trucks onto the fields of rural America, they carried with them a single expectation: punishment. Everything they had been taught, everything they had seen during the war, told them that captivity meant humiliation. In Germany, captured soldiers were treated as expendable labor, starved, beaten, and sent to work in quarries and factories until they collapsed. The thought that their captors would offer them water, rest, and even pay seemed absurd. Yet as they arrived on the wide plains of Kansas, Texas, or Iowa, they discovered a system that operated with calm efficiency and, more surprisingly, with a sense of decency that defied their understanding of war. The shock began on the very first day of labor assignments. The prisoners were unloaded near fields bordered by fences, not barbed wire. They were handed tools, not shackles. American guards, often only a handful, stood at a distance, carrying rifles slung over their shoulders more as formality than threat. The farmers, many of them middle-aged men or elderly veterans, spoke plainly and without hostility, showing the prisoners what to harvest, how to load the wagons, where to stack the bales. Some of the men had never before been so close to civilians in enemy territory. They expected hatred and instead met indifference, even politeness. The contrast was disorienting. What truly unsettled them, however, was the absence of coercion. The work was hard but fair. They were given scheduled breaks, lunch under the shade of a tree, and sometimes fresh water from a tin pail shared among all the workers. There was no shouting, no beatings, no overseers with whips or dogs. The Americans treated the task like any other form of labor, something to be completed efficiently, not vindicatively. For men who had spent years immersed in the militarized logic of the Reich, where fear was the foundation of order, this simple normality felt revolutionary. The bureaucracy of the arrangement reinforced the same message. Each farm operated under a contract with the War Manpower Commission or local agricultural boards. Hours were recorded meticulously, pay rates were standardized, and transportation followed military schedules. Prisoners signed attendance sheets and received slips documenting their work, mundane details that, in their own way, expressed trust. The entire process implied that even the enemy's time and effort were subject to law, not vengeance. It was within this framework that a slow transformation began. Many of the German prisoners had spent their adult lives within the moral structure of dictatorship, where obedience and violence were inseparable. On the American farms, those assumptions crumbled. They were not being re-educated through propaganda. Instead, they were being confronted by a lived example of a society that operated without constant intimidation. The sense of dignity they felt came not from lectures or ideology, but from the simple experience of being treated as human beings. There were moments of unease and contradiction. Some prisoners could not reconcile the kindness of the civilians with the devastation the Allied bombers were inflicting on their cities back home. They felt a kind of guilt, a silent confusion about who the real barbarians were. The newspapers in camp canteens sometimes carried photographs of ruined German towns beside articles about American harvests. The contrast between destruction and abundance became painfully visible. Yet each day's work on the farm chipped away at the wall of fear and hatred that years of indoctrination had built. Occasionally, gestures of friendliness broke through the formal barrier between captor and captive. A farmer's wife would leave a jug of lemonade near the field, or a child would wave to the passing truck. The Germans noticed that the guards often joined in the labor rather than merely overseeing it. Some even realized that the Americans trusted them enough to let them handle sharp tools and heavy machinery. There was no sense of superiority in these exchanges, only the quiet rhythm of shared necessity. For many of the prisoners, this experience became the true beginning of their psychological disarmament. The war had taught them to believe that mercy was weakness and that enemies could only be subdued through domination. Yet here they were, allowed to work with dignity, to rest without fear, and to earn their keep according to international law. This ordinary humanity, the simple, untheatrical fairness of the system, proved to be the most profound catalyst of all. In the months that followed, these early impressions spread through the POW camps like a quiet revelation. Men who had expected to endure captivity now spoke of it as a strange kind of education. They still longed for home, but they began to see that the world beyond the Reich operated by different rules, rules that valued law over ideology, cooperation over coercion. What began as a labor program became, without anyone planning it, a moral experiment on a national scale. And for thousands of German soldiers, their first day on an American farm marked the moment when defeat began to turn into understanding. The system that governed German prisoner labor in the United States during World War II functioned with the precision and discipline of a national institution. It was not improvised or informal but carefully constructed through layers of military, legal, and civilian oversight. The War Department, working in cooperation with the War Manpower Commission and the Department of Agriculture, developed a framework that transformed captivity into regulated employment. Every step, from a prisoner's transfer to a worksite to the calculation of his daily wages, was documented, supervised, and standardized according to federal rules and the Geneva Convention of 1929. At the core of this system was the principle that prisoners of war were to be used for non-military labor essential to the national economy, particularly agriculture and infrastructure. Each military district managed a network of main camps and branch camps. A main camp could house several thousand men and serve as an administrative hub, while dozens of smaller branch camps, sometimes just tents and barbed wire, were established near farms, canneries, or sawmills to provide temporary labor during harvest seasons. The process began when local agricultural boards or private businesses submitted formal requests for labor. Once approved, military trucks transported groups of prisoners, usually between 20 and 50 men, to work locations each morning. A small number of guards accompanied them, though by mid-war the prisoners' discipline and low escape rates often led to reduced supervision. The farmers or contractors then paid the U.S. government directly at a fixed rate, typically 40 to 45 cents per hour per worker. Of this amount, the War Department credited the prisoner with 10 cents per hour as personal earnings. The remaining balance went to the Treasury to offset the costs of housing, feeding, and transporting the men. Prisoners did not receive cash. Instead, they were issued paper scrip or tokens redeemable only within the camp canteen. This policy ensured both security and compliance with international law, which forbade the exploitation of prisoners for profit but allowed controlled remuneration. In the canteens, the shelves reflected a strange blend of wartime austerity and small luxuries: cigarettes, soap, razor blades, stationery, chocolate, postcards, and sometimes even paints, books, or harmonicas. For men who had expected brutal deprivation, these tokens of normal life carried enormous symbolic weight. Within the camps, the organization mirrored that of small towns. Daily routines were strictly scheduled: roll call at dawn, work details assigned, transport arranged, and curfews enforced. Military police managed external security, while within the fences, German non-commissioned officers maintained internal discipline, following the German chain of command as permitted by the Geneva Convention. This arrangement reduced tension and gave the camps an orderly, almost cooperative atmosphere. The American officers in charge often approached their duties with a sense of professionalism rather than hostility. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General emphasized respect for law and efficiency. The International Red Cross conducted regular inspections, ensuring that prisoners received adequate food, medical care, and recreation. Rations were comparable in calories to those of American soldiers, and in some camps, surplus produce from local farms was used to supplement meals. Medical facilities were clean and adequately staffed, an almost unthinkable standard for those who had seen the conditions of forced labor under the Nazi regime. Beyond the physical structure, an intellectual and cultural system began to take shape. Many prisoners, especially those with education or professional backgrounds, organized lectures, music ensembles, and study groups. Some camps hosted formal classes in English, mathematics, history, or even philosophy. In a few cases, local universities collaborated by sending instructors or donating books. The largest of these programs, such as at Camp Ruston in Louisiana and Camp Aliceville in Alabama, developed into full educational institutions with libraries and organized debates. These programs were not official propaganda tools but rather extensions of the American belief that even wartime captivity should preserve the mind as well as the body. The overall design of the program produced a remarkable outcome: a labor force that was both efficient and disciplined, operating under conditions that blurred the line between punishment and rehabilitation. The system's success depended not on coercion but on predictability, on the steady rhythm of work, payment, and humane treatment. Most prisoners adapted quickly to the routine. Escape attempts were rare, and morale, according to military reports, remained relatively stable throughout the war. In the context of total global conflict, the American prisoner labor system stood as an anomaly. It reflected the government's determination to adhere to international law even while fighting an enemy that had shown little regard for it. The bureaucratic thoroughness that defined the process, the contracts, the ledgers, the script books, and the inspection reports, was not mere formality. It represented a quiet but deliberate assertion of values, that even in war, labor could be governed by justice, and that order could exist without brutality. Through this system, the German prisoners came to see the mechanics of a society that functioned not through fear or ideology, but through law, routine, and mutual accountability. Each workday, each ledger entry, each purchase at the camp canteen reinforced that lesson. What began as a logistical necessity evolved into an unintentional demonstration of civilization itself, a living example of how discipline could coexist with humanity. Across the American heartland, from the dusty cotton fields of Texas to the sugar beet farms of Minnesota and the citrus groves of Florida, the German prisoners of war became an unexpected part of rural life. Their labor filled a void that no machine or program could replace. Farmers had lost sons to the draft, and the remaining workforce was aging or already overburdened by wartime demands. When the trucks carrying German POWs first arrived, many civilians watched with unease. The sight of men in gray-green uniforms, once symbols of an enemy regime, now standing quietly with shovels and gloves, was surreal. But over time, the rhythm of daily labor softened those first impressions. The work itself varied by region and season. In the Midwest, prisoners harvested corn, wheat, and sugar beets, often working from dawn until late afternoon under the open sky. In the South, they picked cotton, repaired irrigation ditches, and maintained livestock pens. Along the Gulf Coast and in California, they sorted fruit and vegetables in canneries, packed crates, and operated basic machinery. The tasks were physically demanding but not brutal, designed to mirror the labor performed by American civilians under similar conditions. Every morning began with roll call, followed by a drive in guarded trucks to the farms. The guards, typically older reservists or younger soldiers unfit for frontline duty, quickly realized that strict supervision was rarely necessary. Reports from the War Department and the International Red Cross confirmed that discipline among the German prisoners was exceptionally high. Escape attempts were rare, and when they occurred, most ended within hours. The prisoners often joked among themselves that even if they did manage to flee, they would have nowhere to go in a country so vast and unfamiliar. The general respect for rules, instilled by years of military training, translated easily into the structured routines of agricultural labor. American farmers came to appreciate their efficiency and reliability. Many would later describe the Germans as the best workers they had ever employed. The atmosphere on the farms was often pragmatic rather than hostile. Work crews and local families maintained a polite distance, yet small gestures of civility appeared naturally. A farmer might offer cold water from a well on a hot day, or a foreman might share a cigarette during a break. Some farmers' children watched curiously as the prisoners worked, learning that the faces of the enemy looked much like their own fathers or brothers. These quiet moments of coexistence formed the foundation of an unspoken mutual respect that neither side had expected. In some areas, the relationships deepened beyond simple labor. In states such as Kansas and Nebraska, where the same groups of POWs returned each season, familiarity bred trust. Prisoners were sometimes invited to eat in the shade of a barn or rest briefly near the farmhouse. The American guards, recognizing the low risk of rebellion, would sit with them during meals. On Sundays, when work was suspended, the men were allowed to attend religious services or play soccer on improvised fields. Photographs from camps in Iowa, Colorado, and Alabama show scenes of men smiling, playing instruments, and posing beside American soldiers who had once fought against them. Back inside the camps, the daily experience of fieldwork shaped the prisoners' community life. The wages they earned, camp scrip worth a few dollars a week, circulated through the canteens, where they could buy small luxuries like tobacco, shaving cream, or postcards. Many wrote letters home describing the strangeness of their new environment, the vast landscapes, the abundance of food, the absence of fear. They compared the orderliness of American farms to the scarcity and chaos of wartime Europe. For men who had lived through bombings and military discipline, the routine of farm labor felt almost peaceful, even redemptive. Cultural and recreational life flourished as well. The prisoners organized orchestras, theater troupes, and art exhibitions, often using recycled materials from their surroundings. In some camps, concerts were held for the guards and local residents. At Camp Algona in Iowa, the prisoners built an elaborate nativity scene during Christmas of 1945, carving the figures by hand from local clay and wood. It became a symbol of gratitude, and remains preserved today as a historical monument. Such acts of creation reflected a longing for normalcy, a human response to captivity that blurred the line between prisoner and guest. The field experience of the German POWs thus became a daily negotiation between two worlds, one shaped by the ideology of total war, the other by democratic pragmatism. Each sunrise over the fields reinforced the contrast. The Americans saw discipline without cruelty, the Germans witnessed authority without tyranny. Through shared labor, they discovered that survival could depend not on domination, but on cooperation. For many of the prisoners, these months in the fields left a lasting mark. When they eventually returned to Germany, they carried with them vivid memories of the open landscapes, the quiet respect of their captors, and the strange realization that humanity had followed them even into captivity. The rows of corn and wheat they once harvested became symbols of a moral harvest as well, the idea that dignity could grow in the unlikeliest of soil, even under the shadow of war. By 1944, the program that employed German prisoners of war had expanded far beyond its initial experiment. What began as a wartime necessity in a few rural districts became a nationwide system involving hundreds of camps and thousands of civilian employers. The United States had discovered a paradoxical kind of workforce, disciplined, efficient, and temporary, composed of men who only months earlier had fought against the very people they now served. From the plains of Kansas to the orchards of California, the presence of these men became an ordinary part of the American landscape. The scope of the program was immense. By the war's end, over 425,000 German prisoners had been distributed among more than 700 main and branch camps across 46 states. The largest concentrations were in Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, but smaller work detachments appeared in New England, the Pacific Northwest, and even the Deep South. The network operated under tight coordination between the War Department and local agricultural agencies, who matched seasonal demands to available labor. Entire regions came to rely on the prisoners to sustain production. Farmers in the Midwest depended on them to harvest wheat and corn, while in the South they picked cotton and peanuts, and in the West they gathered fruit, timber, and sugar beets. The prisoners' efficiency quickly transformed local economies. Reports from the War Manpower Commission credited the POW labor system with preventing severe crop losses in 1944 and 1945, years when domestic labor shortages peaked. Communities that had initially viewed the prisoners with suspicion began to see them as essential contributors to wartime stability. Newspaper articles from Texas, Iowa, and Colorado documented a striking shift in public opinion, from fear and resentment to cautious appreciation. Local farmers, many of whom had never traveled outside their counties, found themselves interacting daily with former enemy soldiers and discovering shared habits of work and discipline. Trust, once established, deepened over time. As groups of prisoners returned to the same farms for multiple harvests, familiarity replaced hostility. Some farmers requested the same crews year after year, writing formal letters to military authorities asking for specific men to be reassigned to their properties. The War Department, recognizing the morale benefits, often approved such requests. These relationships sometimes evolved into quiet friendships. There were cases of American families sending letters or care packages to the men after their repatriation, and some former prisoners corresponded for years with the people they had once worked for. Cultural exchange also took unexpected forms. In many camps, the prisoners introduced local Americans to aspects of German culture, music, craftsmanship, and discipline in organization. They built furniture for churches, repaired farm equipment, painted murals, and staged performances for guards and townspeople. The most famous of these creations was the Christmas nativity scene constructed by German POWs at Camp Algona, Iowa, in 1945. Using plaster, local clay, and scrap materials, they sculpted over 60 life-sized figures depicting the birth of Christ. The display, built entirely by men who would soon be sent home, became a symbol of reconciliation and gratitude. The town preserved it after the war, and it remains on display to this day as a monument to the humanity that survived within the machinery of conflict. The impact of the program extended beyond agriculture. POW labor was used to repair roads, clear debris after floods, and assist in timber production. In some states, prisoners worked in sawmills or food processing plants. The United States maintained strict oversight to ensure that none of the work violated the Geneva Convention, which prohibited dangerous or military-related labor. Inspections by the International Red Cross and internal reports consistently praised the program's adherence to international standards, reinforcing America's image abroad as a nation committed to law even in wartime. When the war ended in 1945, the repatriation process began slowly. It would take nearly 2 years to return all German prisoners to Europe, partly because the Allied powers needed labor to rebuild devastated regions. Many of the men who left American soil carried with them memories that challenged the propaganda of their youth. They had expected brutality and had instead found structure, order, and a kind of decency that was unfamiliar yet deeply affecting. For the Americans who had employed them, the experience left its own impression, proof that respect could exist even between enemies. Decades later, oral histories and local archives across the United States preserve stories of the German boys who had helped save farms from ruin. In communities that depended on agriculture, their brief presence became part of regional lore. Children who had once watched the prisoners working in the fields remembered them not as soldiers, but as polite, hard-working men who smiled and waved. For many rural Americans, this quiet encounter with the enemy transformed the abstract notion of war into something more human and complex. In retrospect, the POW labor system represented one of the most successful humanitarian experiments of the war. It demonstrated that discipline and compassion could coexist, and that even within the machinery of total conflict, nations could choose to uphold principles of fairness. What began as a solution to a labor shortage evolved into a moral statement, an assertion that the strength of democracy lay not only in its armies, but in its treatment of those it had conquered. The fields that the German prisoners once tended became silent witnesses to that idea, their rows stretching endlessly across a land that had managed to balance victory with mercy. When the war ended in 1945, the great machinery that had sustained the system of prisoner labor began to unwind. The American camps that had once housed hundreds of thousands of German soldiers slowly emptied as the repatriation process unfolded under Allied supervision. By 1946, trains and ships were carrying these men back across the Atlantic, returning them to a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had left. Many returned to cities reduced to rubble, to families scattered or lost, to a nation stripped of its ideology and divided by occupation zones. Yet among the few things they carried home intact were their memories of captivity in America, memories that quietly contradicted everything the Nazi state had taught them about enemies, justice, and power. For many of these men, their time in American camps had become a moral education. They had entered captivity believing they would be degraded, enslaved, or executed, but they had instead encountered a system governed by rules, bureaucracy, and a peculiar sense of fairness. They had been paid for their labor, given medical care, and treated with a degree of respect that was difficult to reconcile with wartime hatred. It was not kindness in a sentimental sense, but rather a manifestation of law and discipline, a demonstration that a society could exercise strength without cruelty. For men who had grown up in a regime that glorified domination and submission, This was a profound revelation. Upon returning to post-war Germany, many of the former prisoners found themselves caught between devastation and reconstruction. Factories were gone, governments dissolved, and moral certainty shattered. Yet the lessons they had absorbed in the fields and camps of America remained vivid. They had witnessed a functioning democracy from the inside, not as tourists or conquerors, but as captives who had seen its mechanisms at work in the smallest details of daily life. They remembered the consistency of the rations, the predictability of wages, the impartiality of the officers, and the strange fact that even the defeated could still rely on the law. These impressions became, for many, the first seeds of a new worldview. Historians later observed that former POWs often became disproportionately active in the rebuilding of post-war German institutions. Some took roles in local governance, trade unions, or education. Others simply carried home an altered understanding of authority and justice. Their experience stood as living proof that an ordered, lawful society could exist without fear. In oral histories recorded decades later, many recalled how the Americans' insistence on procedures, paying for labor, maintaining humane conditions, enforcing fair rules, had seemed frustratingly rigid at the time, but came to symbolize something larger, a respect for human dignity expressed through structure rather than sentiment. This perspective found resonance in the emerging democratic ethos of West Germany. As the Federal Republic took shape under Allied supervision, its founders emphasized legality, transparency, and individual rights, principles that aligned closely with what many ex-POWs had witnessed firsthand. Some scholars argued that the experience of captivity in the United States contributed subtly but meaningfully to this transformation. Though it was never an official policy of re-education, the American system of humane containment functioned as an unspoken lesson in democratic order. The legacy extended beyond politics. In personal terms, the former prisoners carried with them a nuanced understanding of humanity. They spoke of the paradox of being treated well by the very nation that had destroyed their armies. Some expressed guilt for the brutality their own government had inflicted on Allied captives. Others described the experience as their first genuine encounter with moral equality. The memories of shared labor, of honest payment for work, of music and learning within the fences, became moral touchstones that outlived the war itself. In small towns across America, the memory of the German POWs also lingered. Farmers who had employed them often spoke of their discipline and reliability. Some communities maintained contact for years after the war, exchanging letters and photographs. A few former prisoners eventually returned to the United States as immigrants, drawn back by the same order and stability they had first encountered as captives. Their return was quiet, unnoticed by history, yet it symbolized the full circle of an experience that had begun with conquest and ended with understanding. The legacy of the German prisoners in America was thus twofold, practical and philosophical. Practically, they had sustained the nation's farms and industries during its hour of need. Philosophically, they had participated in an experiment that revealed how even war could be governed by restraint. Their story demonstrated that the moral strength of a democracy was measured not in its victories, but in how it treated those who could no longer fight back. In the ruined landscapes of post-war Germany, as men rebuilt houses and lives, the memory of that paradox, that an enemy could be just, that captivity could coexist with dignity, became a quiet foundation for something new. It suggested that civilization did not end with defeat and that the true test of freedom was not in triumph, but in the ability to treat one's adversaries as men rather than enemies. For those who had learned that lesson in the faraway fields of America, it remained one of the few certainties that survived the war. The story of the German prisoners of war who worked on American farms was not simply one of captivity or mercy. It was a quiet meditation on what civilization truly meant when stripped of its illusions. Beneath the vast skies of the American Midwest, far from the battlefields of Europe, an invisible experiment unfolded, one that tested whether the principles of humanity could survive amid global destruction. It was not fought with weapons but with routines, gestures, and a belief that law and decency could hold firm even when the world itself seemed to collapse. In these fields, the moral order of the war inverted itself. Men who had been taught that might was the only form of truth discovered a new hierarchy, one in which respect, not domination, commanded obedience. The Germans who once marched under banners of absolute power found themselves obeying rules written in another spirit: fairness, accountability, and restraint. Every day of labor, every paycheck, every unspoken moment of trust between guard and worker became a lesson in the fragility and strength of those ideals. To be paid by the enemy for honest work was more than an economic act. It was a symbolic dismantling of an entire worldview. It proved that value could exist without coercion, that justice could be administered without humiliation, and that even in victory, compassion could remain disciplined rather than sentimental. The American system was not without its flaws. Some guards were harsh, some locals suspicious. But within the machinery of war, it managed to preserve the essence of civilization, the recognition that dignity should not vanish with defeat. For the German prisoners, this revelation unfolded slowly, often without words. The quiet order of the farms, the predictability of meals, the lawful rhythm of each day, all stood in stark contrast to the chaos and fanaticism they had left behind. They realized that a society's true strength lay not in its weapons or slogans but in its capacity for restraint. The absence of cruelty became, paradoxically, the most powerful assertion of moral authority. In that absence, they encountered something that Nazi ideology had declared impossible: a form of power that did not depend on fear. This understanding reached beyond the individuals who experienced it. It spoke to the moral architecture of democracy itself, the belief that order can be maintained without oppression, that even those who have fought and lost retain the right to fairness. The American treatment of POWs did not erase the horrors of war, nor did it absolve either side of its crimes, but it revealed a glimpse of what a post-war world might look like if it were built on justice rather than vengeance. In that sense, the farms of Kansas and Texas, of Iowa and Alabama, became quiet classrooms of moral reconstruction long before peace was officially declared. The philosophical significance of this story lies in its simplicity. It showed that war, for all its violence, cannot completely extinguish the structures of empathy and law if a society chooses to preserve them. The German soldiers came to understand that their captors' strength did not arise from dominance but from discipline, a discipline that demanded they treat even the defeated as human beings. This was not sentimentality, but a form of moral engineering, designed not for forgiveness but for stability. And it worked. The American system proved that humanity, when codified into practice, could outlast the passions of war. In the stillness of the American plains, among the hum of insects and the creak of wooden fences, an idea quietly took root. It was the idea that civilization is measured not by how it triumphs over its enemies, but by how it restrains itself in victory. Every harvested field, every signed time sheet, every letter sent home by a prisoner reflected that principle. The Germans who once saw mercy as weakness began to recognize it as strength, the kind that endures when weapons rust and flags fade. The war had been a contest of ideologies, but in the end, one of its quietest victories belonged to the idea of humane order. The American handling of German POWs demonstrated that moral power could coexist with military might, that discipline could be humane, and that decency, if practiced consistently, could become a form of resistance against the very logic of total war. Long after the barbed wire was torn down, what remained was not bitterness but memory, the memory of a time when the victors chose humanity over humiliation. And in that choice, something extraordinary occurred. The meaning of victory itself changed. It was no longer defined solely by the surrender of armies, but by the preservation of the principles that made peace possible. Among the endless rows of wheat and cotton, under skies untouched by bombs, humanity reclaimed a small but enduring victory, one that proved that compassion, when protected by law and conscience, could survive even the darkest chapters of history.